Okay, why don't we get going? Thanks everyone for coming. I want to briefly introduce our panelists and our moderator before stepping aside. As some of you know who aren't students of the class, this is our seventh in an eight-part series of lectures on police violence in Albuquerque. We have one more next week, by the way. I think it's in the same room, if I'm not mistaken. Is it?
It says Mirage Thunderbird.
Okay, then I'm wrong. Thank you for someone.
They send you all over.
Yes. So next Thursday from 2 to 3:15, Peter Simonson, Executive Director of the ACLU in New Mexico, and Nancy Koenigsberg, Executive Director of Disability Rights New Mexico, will be talking about the consent decree between the city and the Department of Justice regarding reforms to the police department. That's next week. That's our last one. This is our second to last, and I'm really pleased to briefly introduce our presenters this week. Immediately to my right is Alan Wagman. Alan Wagman has been an attorney for 20 years. For 14 of those years, he's been a criminal defense attorney. Many of those years, he's worked in the public defender's office. In 2013, Alan and 10 other people were appointed to the Police Oversight Task Force by the City Council, right, and charged with recommending changes to the police oversight ordinance. One of the things they'll discuss is what actually happened to those recommendations and those changes. So thank you very much for coming, Alan. To Alan's right is City Council President Ray Gardun. Ray has been a member of the Albuquerque City Council since 2007. Is that right?
That's correct.
District 6, which encompasses the university. Nob Hill goes all the way to Eubank, so includes the International District. Ray was the co-sponsor of the ordinance abolishing the old police oversight commission and creating the civilian police oversight agency. Along with, I'm sorry, who was the co-sponsor?
Brad Winter.
Brad Winter and Ray Gardun. And so moderating, so the conversation today will be about police oversight. We're going to focus our questions on the question of police oversight in Albuquerque. We're going to devote plenty of time to question and answer afterwards. The questions will be moderated by Ali Romero. Ali is a senior at UNM, and she's majoring in multimedia journalism. I'm going to turn it over to her, and she can start the conversation. So let's give our presenters a round of applause for this. Thanks.
Perfect. All right, thank you. So I know that David gave us a little bit of some. Sorry. I know that David gave us a little background on each of your positions, but I was hoping that you could be more specific as to why you decided to go into public service and more specifically how you became interested in the topic of police violence.
Is that to me?
To both of you,
Oh.
but you can go first.
No. Okay. Well, let me start by saying that it wasn't so much that I was interested in police violence. I just had known about police violence for a long period of time before I even was on the city council. Rito Canales was murdered in 1994 and framed with having stolen some dynamite from one of the excavation places down in the South Valley. They had been wanting to get to him, if you will, for a long period of time, and the police and sheriff's department and state police, all three agencies, if you will, converged on where they had heard he was at, and then planted some dynamite sticks, I guess, I don't know how they come, but anyway, and proceeded to attack the two folks that were there. Rito Canales was the one that was murdered. So it goes way back. I, through the Southwest Organizing Project and many other organizations that I had worked with, knew that there was a problem. But there was no nexus. There was no place to really apply pressure. When we'd go to elected officials or anyone, they would look at you like that's a mountain you're not going to climb, and certainly a mountain that we're not going to climb. So fast forward to 2007, and just before that, my son and a number of people had worked very hard to get public financing. Public financing is where you are eligible to run for office without having to raise money, if you will, by begging people, which is what most elected officials are apt to do, or sell their souls for a few shekels. So when that came up, my son, who still is, I think, one of the few occasions where the son is the mentor to the father, and that's what he is, and he proceeded to set up a situation where I ran and I won. Now to go forward to what is it we wanted to do. And a very quick thing. May 1st, 2006. He and the Southwest Organizing Project and other folks had a rally at Civic Plaza. About 5,000 people showed up. We were down at the, all of you know where that Civic Plaza area is. And we were down there and, you know, doing the thing we do, asking for justice. And when did we want it? We wanted it right there and then. And we noticed that City Hall was to our left immediately. And there was not even a whisper of interest from anyone except the police. There were, somebody counted, 40 riot festooned police just inside City Hall, waiting for something to happen. And there were 4 people that were just really interested in having any of us react to what they were doing, and they were being obnoxious and whatever. And I still remember today that, again, I'm going to invoke my mentor. And Tomas stood in front of those 4 folks and then turned his back to them and told us, not a person reacts to these 4 folks unless you want to go through me. And he knew that those folks wanted us to do something so that the riot police could come out and then exercise what they knew best. Okay, now fast forward 2007. I'm elected, and one of the first things that I noticed were reports. They were called Police Oversight Commission reports. And they were just gobbledygook. They were these numbers of citizen police complaints, every single one of them exonerated, every one. From traffic stops to encounters, accusations from citizens that were just dismissed. They didn't even get to the chief. The chief didn't even have to decide. They were exonerated at the commission. So I started asking questions, and I remember Judge Deaton, who was a federal judge, had been a federal judge, and then became the IRO, the Independent Review Officer, wanted to take me to task for asking questions about the report. And so he and I got into a thing right there at City Council, and I reminded him that he was the employee. He was no longer a federal judge. And for 2 years, nothing was done. Finally, he quit, and a new person by the name of Robin Hammer took over that position, and nothing happened for another 2.5 years, at which point I wanted to have some level of bipartisanship, and I asked Brad Winter if he would be interested in looking at the commission as it existed and what else could be done. I'm going to stop there because I know that we're going to have time to talk about more detail. But I just wanted to get that as a backdrop to my involvement, both as an elected official and in the police oversight issue. Now I don't know if I'll throw it back to you.
Oh, thank you. Alan, could you just speak towards how you chose the path into public service as well?
Well, I've always been interested in human rights. I can't tell you exactly why. The interest was just there. Till I was 17 or so, I believed that our government told us the truth. And then Vietnam exploded. So I lost that faith. Over the years, I've done human rights work in Guatemala. From 2001 to 2006, I was on the board of the New Mexico ACLU, and I left because I felt that the ACLU in New Mexico and nationally was insufficiently committed to civil liberties. I've began as a lawyer almost by accident as a public defender in 1995, did indigent criminal defense until 2006, when I went to work for the Children, Youth, and Families Department, and I went back to being a public defender, this time in Albuquerque. I had been in Roswell and Silver City before. I've been in the public defender department here in Albuquerque since September 2012. Part of my job in the public defender office was looking at cases before, felony cases before they were indicted, and reading criminal complaints of every felony arrest. When a cop has, when there's an incident, the first document that a police officer fills out after arresting somebody to charge them is a criminal complaint. And what astonished me reading the criminal complaints was how many things police officers were doing wrong that they didn't even know were wrong. And you could tell they didn't know they were wrong because they didn't try to disguise them. The matter-of-fact tone in which they wrote these reports, talking about all the things they did, was absolutely astonishing. So after 6 or 7 months of reading these reports, I saw a notice that they were looking for people to volunteer to rewrite a police oversight ordinance. And frankly, I didn't know what was broken about the old police oversight system, but I thought I did have some insight into what police were doing. So I volunteered, and it's been both one of the greatest opportunities and one of the biggest mistakes of my life.
Thank you. I want to go back to Ray. This past September, you and other members of the City Council abolished the Police Oversight Commission and passed an ordinance creating the Civilian Police Oversight Agency in its place. Can you explain to us what was wrong with the old ordinance and what's better about the new ordinance?
Well, let me start by saying that we abolished the old commission, and I'll differentiate between the two by calling the one the commission, which is the old system, and the new one, the board, which is what is in place now. We knew it wasn't working based on a lot of things. Some of them I touched on by saying that it was just unusual for me that every single incident, a police officer was exonerated. I couldn't believe that citizens would complain just for the heck of it, that or they had it in for the police or many of those things. So I then asked, this is way back, this is 2010. I asked, because I had just purchased an iPod, little iPod thing with a video camera capability. And, I was fascinated by it and videotaped, and I think it had capacity of about an hour. So I asked Chief Schultz at the time, why don't we, because I researched it and there were such things as, they were called on-body cameras. And very few police departments were using them. And now we know why. And I asked, why don't we use some method of recording the interchange? It doesn't have to be, they said, well, we can't do it, we have to have some privacy or something or other. I said, this is whenever you have a citizen encounter. It doesn't have to be on 24/7. Just whenever you stop someone, turn on the camera. It's for your own protection. They said, well, it won't work or whatever. Well, Chief Schultz and I were talking. I was recording our situation, mostly him. on this iPod. And the quality was all right, but at least we could see that that could be done. Soon after that, actually about a year later, there was a discussion about on-body cameras or lapel cameras. 350 of them we paid for. We allocated money to buy those. None of them were being used. Finally, about a year after that, some of them were issued, and lo and behold, none of them worked. The cords would come off, the batteries would run out, and these were batteries that supposedly had a capacity to run for 24 hours or something like that. Anyway, I think I'm going off subject a little bit, but what was your exact question?
What was wrong with the old ordinance and what's?
Well, yeah, so the old ordinance just played into the fact that police could do no wrong. And remember, this is an agency, a department, a part of our social structure that we're all afraid of. I mean, I don't care who in here thinks that they can have an encounter with a policeman and that it's going to be a good situation. All of us know that we're subservient. And we've been told that we only get stopped because we've done something wrong. So given that, we as a society have this sense of, if these folks are going to stop you and you haven't done anything wrong, boy, you better pray that they can't come up with something creative to accuse you of it. The other thing is that also as a society, we've learned that some of us are disposable and some of us are at a level, whether we admit it or not, whether it's people of color, whether it's people who find themselves in a situation that's on towards homelessness, whatever it is, that, thank goodness, they are between that situation and myself. And none of us hope ill for anyone else, but when we see someone stopped, we know that they're but for fortune. Go I. So, based on that, I knew that the police, when they were complained about, more than likely had done something that was not right. And it should be adjudicated, or at least brought before the commission so it could be investigated. And as I said before, that commission did not have the power to do anything. They just listened to the presentation and nodded their heads, and the meeting was over and that's it. And lo and behold, the next time a report came out, those police were exonerated. And I knew that was wrong. And I knew that that commission had no power. Not only because it was built into the system that they could not bring any kind of charges, if you will, or any kind of disciplinary action against the police. So why? Why have that? I mean, the folks that were complaining, the citizens that were complaining, didn't want a sounding board. They wanted something to happen. And that's when, as I said, I asked Brad Winter if he would join me in sponsoring an ordinance that would abolish the commission and then look at setting up another agency, the board. And Mr. Wagman was part of the task force that was set up to look at how that would work. I had no part in that, none whatsoever. Neither did any of the other counselors. Council staff are the ones that then vetted the members of that task force, and then they independently. I never went to any of those meetings, and I didn't want to. I didn't want it to sound as if I had any influence or I wanted something to happen. I thought it should be as the task force saw it. And I'm sure Mr. Wagman would be able to talk to that a lot better than I could because he was part of it.
Thank you. Alan, we'll go to you. like Ray was discussing, you were a member of the Police Oversight Task Force that made specific recommendation to the City Council regarding changes to the ordinance. Are you satisfied with the new board, and does it address the problems you identified in the old commission?
I'm going to say something first, let me write down the question.
Sure.
Just quickly, not quite on topic, Councilman Gardun said something about people being afraid of the police. A week ago today, I got on an Amtrak train to Los Angeles. There were police on the train. They could have been federal agents. They could have been Albuquerque police working with federal agents. I know from my job that both worked that train. And they were asking people questions. And when they got to me, and they started asking me, where was I going? I said, with all due respect, officer, I choose not to answer any questions. And I said it loud enough so that everybody around me could hear. The cop looked at me and said, that's your right, sir. And he turned to the person next to me. Now, one might think that the people around me might have taken a cue. Not one of them refused to talk to the officer. I'll tell you now, just quickly, if you want help from a police officer, talk to the officer. If the officer wants to talk to you, with all due respect, officer, I choose not to answer any questions. What will be written down from your answers is not what you said and not what you meant, but what the cop wanted you to mean. And you won't even be dishonest about it. We all translate what other people said. If you don't want to incriminate yourself, don't answer questions. Am I satisfied with the board? I think was the first question. I don't know. They're all new. It's too new. Did the ordinance address the problems? I think the first thing I have to say about that is that no police oversight ordinance will ever really address the problems. The real issue on whether oversight works is not what's in the ordinance. It's whether the people in charge of the police, including the police chain of command, are committed to doing things right. If they are, it works. If they're not, it doesn't. Police oversight is not a solution. It assists if there is a commitment to a solution. It's worthless if they're not, if there is no commitment. And I wrote a brief in the federal lawsuit and on behalf of the Public Defender Department, and so I go to meetings of organizations that submitted briefs. And at the last meeting we had with the Justice Department, the Justice Department representative said about police oversight, police oversight is not necessary for reform of a police department. It's not necessary. If it is not done well, it is harmful. If it is done well, it can be helpful. But necessary? No. So let's start with that. We're not talking about the core issue. The core issue is whether the mayor, the chief administrative officer, who's the direct supervisor of the chief of police, and down the police chain of command are committed to getting it right. And it also matters whether the city council is putting pressure on the mayor and the chief administrative officer and the chief of police to make sure that the police chain of command is committed to doing it right. That's far more important than any oversight. So, am I satisfied with the current board is almost an irrelevant question. I'm not satisfied with the mayor. I'm not satisfied with the chief administrative officer. I'm not satisfied with the chief of police. I'm not satisfied with the head of the SWAT unit who was criticized by the Department of Justice for running an undisciplined bunch of cowboys, being put as second command of the police department. I'm not satisfied with directly below the former director of the SWAT unit, an officer who burned a man's ear partially off with a taser, while two other officers were beating him up. Who now says, oh, we didn't know enough about tasers then. And I'm proud of the responsibility that I take for training officers, but this was the man who was in command of the police who killed James Boyd, is now third in line in the police chain of command. And these people were being paid all three of these people were being paid $100,000 a year. With money approved by city council. I warned Councilor Gardun I was not going to be nice to city council. That's far more important.
As long as you're nice to me, doesn't it?
That's far more important than what happens in an oversight ordinance. And you know, there's a real problem there. Now, does the new ordinance address the problems with the old ordinance? One of the problems with it does create independence, where in the old ordinance, the city attorney just threw a monkey wrench and took the investigative staff out of control of the Police Oversight Commission and made it independent and operate by itself. And I thought city council could have and should have they could have done a quick fix to that right then by making clear what their intent was in the old ordinance, but that didn't happen. This does make clear that the staff reports to the Police Oversight Board. But I think that city council has fallen down in that between the creation of the new board and the expiration of the commission, they left the old independent review officer who was thoroughly criticized by the Department of Justice, basically in control. That basically established, and wittingly or unwittingly, I'm sure it was unwittingly, an independent power base for the person in that position, regardless of who that person was, and regardless of what I may think, or anybody else might think about that particular person. The council then made that person interim executive director with no supervision, which created even more of a power base. The council then asked that person to write rules for the new oversight body. Now, so you understand what rules are. This, at all levels of government, the legislative body passes a law, and then the agency tasked with carrying out that law writes rules where here's how we're going to carry it out, and here's how people who are trying to obey the law have to obey it. Well, in this instance, the council asked the interim executive director, who has no supervisor, to write the rules, leaving out who the interim executive director is. Do you ever want an employee to write his or her own job description in the absence of any input from the employer, especially when the employer is going to be coming in brand new? You are having the employee creating a power base for him or herself. This was a very bad decision by city council. What should happen is the rules should be written after the Police Oversight Board comes in by somebody who is going to come to them and say, you could do it this way or you could do it that way. What do you want to implement? Do you want it to work like this? Do you want it to work like that? here's options for how it could go, how do you want it to happen? But instead what we've got is somebody who's been operating without supervision, making her own decisions. So to that extent, in terms of operation, no, I'm not happy. And I'm not satisfied that the new system addresses concerns about the old system. The biggest problem I have with the structure of the ordinance itself is the oversight task force recommended that the police oversight board be able to audit, to look into at random any number of files of investigations into police conduct. There was no limitation on the number of files, just that they would conduct audits at random and as they chose to do. And this was to get a reasonable idea of what police were doing and how they were performing. And the audit was not restricted to any particular type of violation of police operating procedures. So that audit that we've suggested authorizing would have been able to look at how do police deal with people with disabilities, how do police deal with racial minorities, economic minorities, different kinds of neighborhoods, social and economic status in neighborhoods. There were how does police deal with mental health issues? There was a whole wide range of issues that the Police Oversight Board could have looked at under what the Oversight Task Force recommended. And the Oversight Task Force recommended that the Oversight Board be able to look to pick out specific files to look at and see what was done. Now, our idea for the reason that we recommended that was because the Oversight Board is responsible for supervising staff, and the staff is doing the investigation. If you cannot say, I want to see how that matter was investigated, you can't supervise those staffers, whether it be the executive director who's in charge or to see how the executive director is supervising lower level people. The ordinance as passed eliminated the ability to look at specific files. I want to say to look at specific files, it wasn't to reopen disciplinary proceedings against officers, because once that's done, that's done. Now, there's been an amendment that sort of partially covers that aspect of it. But the rest of the ordinance, it says that upon a supermajority vote of the Oversight Board, the Oversight Board may audit at random 10%, so there's a limitation on how many files can be audited, of files involving use of force complaints. So only a specific type of complaint and only a specific number. What that means essentially is that in any given year, if the Oversight Board has audited 10% of use of force complaints, the executive director and the rest of her staff know they have a pass. The Oversight Board can't look at anything else. We tried when it came up, to ask that it be looked at again. These were last-minute amendments after the Oversight Board had made its recommendations, and the city's hired attorney said, if you don't approve this ordinance, I'm not going to have an agreement with the Department of Justice. Keep in mind, the Department of Justice's position was, you don't need oversight. It's good. You need good oversight if you're going to have it. If it's not going to be good, you don't need it. It wouldn't have held up any agreement, but that's what the city's attorney told the council. So, yeah, it improves some things, but in some crucial areas, I do not. I would have voted on an up or down vote on that night, and now, if you'd asked me to vote for that ordinance or vote against it, I'd have voted against it.
Thank you. Ray, can you respond to those criticisms?
Sure. And I didn't take them as criticism. I took them as observations. And are you sure you just were a lawyer for 20 years? Sounded like a brief. Not very brief. So let me go back to some of what Mr. Wagman said. The task force was tasked with coming up with ways of making a new board succeed. Some of the things that are in the ordinance that I think will work, and that is the operating process for the board, is that they will no longer be under the aegis of the city attorney. They will now be able to hire their own, maybe you can apply, Mr. Wagner. They have their own legal advisor. So they don't have to essentially go through the morass of the city attorney and essentially being told, no, you can't do that, which is what they were told all the time. Or if you want to do that, then we will essentially not respond to it, and we're the legal branch of city government. So all those things were erased, if you will, or at least moved out of the way. So just to answer the concern about the city or any of those departments having control over the board. Has the board done a great job? They've had 2 meetings. The first one was fraught with absolute pandemonium. I mean, nobody knew what they were supposed to do. And that was partially because of the way it was set up. And whose fault was it? Probably the council. And they should have really had a hiatus, a period of time when they were trained. Trained to know what they were supposed to do, trained to know what their jobs are. And that didn't happen. So that first meeting, I attended that one, was, as I said, just a lot of people wondering, what are we doing here? We have fixed that by saying that they will not hear CPCs until they have gone through a level of training, a process that they will be able to then come into their position with background, knowing what they're supposed to do and how to do it. Then I think we can assess whether they're successful or not, or what needs to be changed. And you have to remember that as an observer, not myself, but anybody that's observing as an individual, it's easy to criticize the fact that somebody forgot to close the door. That's not the issue. The issue is it going to work as a board? Is it going to be something that helps the police department? The other part of being an observer is that that's all you are. You're able to observe, castigate or whatever, and then walk away. As a participant, an elected official, I'm there from the beginning to the end. When I get into that, in my case, I have 8 other folks that I have to deal with, not myself. The 9 of us have to deal with each other. It is a game of numbers. One of the things I learned being an elected official is that you don't have to be a physicist, but you gotta know how to add. Up to at least 5. And if you don't have 5 folks on your side, it's a lost cause. So don't let anybody lead you to think that this is a monolith, that this is a situation where everything's already been decided and all you have to do is go in and put down your pebbles and things are decided. They're not. Up until the vote, in many cases, myself, I don't know how it's going to go. I know how I wish it would go, but that's it. So the politics of things, everybody likes to ridicule politics, but that's a system that we all chose. If you don't like it, I suggest we go into another kind of system. I'm too old to do that. You young folks can do that. But it's not the best of systems. And democracy is not a spectator sport. Anybody that thinks that they can just sort of criticize and walk away, I don't even want to listen to them. If they don't want to dirty their hands and get out on the street and do the work that needs to be done, they're just talking heads as far as I'm concerned. And, you know, I'll listen to it, but I hope they don't think that that's gonna be manna for me, because it isn't. You show me your commitment, and I'll stand right next to you. You show me your ability to criticize, and I'll just put you on that list. So, I don't mean this to be a council, Mr. Wagman thing, because as I said, I'm one of 9 folks. And those 9 folks are legislators. We pass laws. The executive branch carries out those laws. The executive branch hires and fires staff. We have nothing to do with that. At the time that the chief, the mayor, the CAO, chief operating officer, when those folks make those decisions or make rules and procedures, we have nothing to do with that. In fact, we're prohibited by charter not to be involved in the execution of those laws. We are prohibited by charter not to meddle in the day-to-day operation of the city. Is that a good thing? I don't know. That's the system we have. It is a crazy system. We have a very strong mayoral system in Albuquerque. There are very few others. Most others are what is known as a mayor council or mayor commission. Santa Fe, for instance, has that. The mayor participates in every single piece of legislation, does not have a vote unless there's a tie. But he does not sit back and say, okay, thank you for the legislation, now I get to interpret it and do such as I want until you pass another law that prohibits me from doing that. So, if you want to change it, I'm all for it. I'd give up my seat tomorrow.
Thank you for your response. I would like to go ahead and open up the discussion to the audience for a Q&A.
I have a quick one for you. Thank you guys again. My name is Anthony Rodriguez, and my question stems out of what you were just talking about. And it seems that it's weird that it's called the city council, but doesn't have any authority in like hiring or firing city officials or things like that, right? So, what do you think about also reforms to the city council system, and what do you see as possible outlets to bring that authority and merge the departments so that it's collaborative, not like one saying the other, you know, one being able to determine everything and one being able to determine everything. Do you see that as a possibility?
I see it as a hope. I would hope that at one point the council would have certain ability to at least weigh in on the hiring and firing. We tried that and it didn't go any further than just having been passed at the council, but it has to be a referendum. But we wanted to be able to hire and fire the police and fire chief. And it didn't happen because it wasn't able to get on the ballot. We're hoping that at this ballot, the October ballot, we're able to do that. I will be, or other councilors have talked about it also, to resurrect at least that part of it. But I agree that I think we should have a system where the council, if they're going to pass a law, essentially stand behind it by having the staff to carry it out. That would have to change pretty much wholeheartedly the system that we have right now. In the system that we have right now, it sort of replicates the state and federal system, where you have an executive branch, the governor, the president, and then the legislators. But even in the state and federal level, they have a better ability to negotiate, if you will, to at least make laws that are more specific and have not only appropriation to it, but the ability to carry out that piece of legislation. We don't. Once we pass the legislation, it is out of the legislative branch, onto the executive branch. I'm glad to say that I'd like to see a socialist system, that really puts everybody into the power structure.
I partially agree with the councilman. I'm a lawyer because I believe that a system is better than no system. What's also true is any system has problems. And if you think you're going to solve your problems by changing systems, all you're really doing is trading one set of problems for another set. So the best answer is to find a way within the system that you have. What I would like to see, rather than looking at trying to change the system, is the council is limited in its power, as Councilman Gardun said. But the mayor, for example, is asking for $4.7 million for police reforms. The council cannot dictate to the mayor what the mayor does with that money, or who he appoints, or things like that. But the council can put, there's some restrictions on the money, can mandate that the mayor provide detailed reports and send somebody to report to the council in person at regular intervals, can make sure that the mayor is accountable for how that money is spent, can make sure, for example, I mentioned the three people, the deputy chief and the two majors that were hired at about $100,000 each, and in addition, there was a public relations officer hired for APD for $100,000. And this was when pardon my phone. This was at a time when the mayor had asked for $2 million to start the reform process. And then $400,000 was used to create top-down positions after the Department of Justice reported problems all the way up and down. And that $400,000 wasn't a one-time expense out of that $2 million. It's year in, year out, every year. The council can put more strings on the money that it authorizes, and it can demand more detail from the mayor about how the money is going to be spent, and it can do that within the present system. And the true test of whether or not the council is doing its job is not to say we need a different system, but how are you going to use the system you've got?
If I may, just very quickly. Tonight at 5 o'clock will be the report on the mayor's budget at city chambers. You're all welcome to come and express your opinions about what that budget has or doesn't have, how it is going to be expended or not. Social services are one of the ones that suffers the most and most deeply. That $4.7 million that Mr. Wagman's talking about is not a slush fund for the mayor. It is a direct appropriation for the cost of a monitor and the DOJ consent decree. That has nothing to do with, when I just heard it now, I was searching my mind because I read the budget, and nowhere is there $4.7 million for the mayor to do as he wishes. That is directly because of the consent decree, and as I said, the monitor and the cost. $3 million is going to be paid out to the monitor and his array of folks and expenditures. His travel alone for the next year is, if I remember correctly, it's about $187,000, about $20,000 at a time. And I don't know whether he's flying with an entourage, first class, or Air Force One. But those are the costs that sometimes people latch onto, thinking that they just found a way to save money. Well, it's expensive to run a city, especially when police department's out of control.
I want to actually ask a question for anyone else too. Before I do, it does seem like there's a lot of money to be made in police reform, doesn't there, right? And even though Alan won't say the name of that cop who burned off a homeless man's ear his name is Tim Gonterman. That's the name of the cop who in 2002 burned off Jerome Hall's ear. Right? Jerome was later killed in a murder. Gonterman's now, is he deputy chief? He was commander. Then
He's major.
in the last year, he's been promoted from commander to major to deputy chief.
No, just major.
No, he was a commander when James Boyd was killed. He was the commander of the area command where James Boyd was killed in. And then he was promoted to major, and then he was promoted to deputy chief.
Huntsman is deputy chief.
No, there's three.
Huntsman is the assistant chief.
Whatever.
There's ridiculous layers here, isn't there? But I had a question for Alan and Ray. If you have a response, I'd like to hear it too. I was actually a bit alarmed by what I heard you say. I agree with you around in your sort of, characterization of police oversight that ultimately what ends up really mattering on a day-to-day basis in terms of what actually happens in the police department. It really matters who the police chief is, and, right? Who the mayor is. That really matters. And so what I want, maybe you could clarify, because to me it seems to me that if there's nothing that we can do to institutionalize accountability through police oversight, if there's nothing that police oversight can do to institutionalize accountability, then there's nothing we can do about the problem of police violence, because it's always just going to be a matter of if we're lucky to get the decent police chief and a decent mayor who's not like the one we have now. And it's one of the reasons why I and others have called for meaningful police oversight that gives that commission the authority to fire cops, to hire and fire cops. And there's not a single police oversight commission in the United States that can do that. So let me ask you, Alan, I mean, even if there was a police oversight commission to have that authority to hire and fire cops without having to deal with the police chief and the mayor, would that satisfy you as a kind of a change in oversight that would actually make a difference? Or is your position that police oversight really, ultimately in the end, doesn't really matter?
No, police oversight matters. It matters because if the city's leadership wants to do something, it's an enormous help. Where I would take issue with you, David, is your characterization. If we're lucky enough to have a good mayor, if we're lucky enough to have a good police chief, ultimately, the issue is political. It's an issue of power. It is the responsibility of the people of a community to elect officials who will do what needs to be done. And if the people of the community don't do that, there's no amount of police oversight, even with the ability to fire officers, that will work. And the problem with, even if you could have police oversight with the power to fire officers, then you trade the problem of they don't have to listen to the civilian overseers for the problem of they do. How would you like to be, whether it's a police officer or any job, where you have two different supervisors, both of whom could fire you, each of whom is telling you to do something different? It simply isn't workable. You'll never get anybody who would take that job as a fool. As much as we don't like the fact that civilian oversight can't impose discipline, that is the police chief that does, once you start allowing more than one person to start imposing discipline, you make the job impossible. What you need is to have the people of the city make sure that their officials are held accountable for the way they deal with and discipline and supervise the police.
Well, yeah, I mean, it would be a hopeless situation if we went down the road of, if there's nothing we can do, then we may as well give up. I don't believe that. I believe that there's a lot of hard work to be done, but we just gotta do it. The community is ready to do it. It just needs folks to essentially either lead or get the hell out of the way. And I've committed myself to that. Now, can one person alone do it? Probably not. Can 2 or 3 or 4 do it? More than likely not. 5, we start getting a preponderance of folks. 6, we start talking about real power. 7, 8, and 9, in this situation, we now have essentially a dialogue going. And the dialogue should be very direct with the community that those people are serving. I know that Mr. Wagman, Alan took umbrage at changing the system. I still think we can change the system. Call me naive, but I'm 73 years old, and I haven't given up. The whole idea that we have to live under the same yoke forever is just not and that's something I will subscribe to. And I don't despair. I get disappointed, but I don't despair. Then, I talk to a lot of young folks. I mentioned Southwest Organizing Project. One of the places where I go to remember that there are folks who have passion, have just this enormous amount of energy, never mind anything else, and the intelligence to carry out that desire. So when we have a system that reflects the community's desires, we will have changed the system. And I'm not going to sit here and tell you what that's going to be, but I know it has to change. Because for us to, and that's the kind of thing that we hear all the time. At council, I hear it incessantly. There will always be poor people. There will always be immigrants. There will always, no. No. I mean, that's silly. And if you ascribe to that, then I don't want to walk the same path you're walking, because you're going to lead me in the wrong direction. I will not subscribe to the fact that we are doomed because we don't know what else to do. We just need to grab each other by the scruff of the neck and say, look, we got work to do, and let's do it. And let's stop using those euphemisms, those situations where we essentially tell each other that we don't have the fortitude, we don't have the ability, and we don't have the whatever else. And that's the way it's always going to be, and I just don't believe it.
Just with the list, any list where you think that I don't want to change the system, I'm a socialist too.
Let's do it together.
Reasonable, how did I want to say it? Reasonably informed people know that race matters, and race matters in police-citizen contacts. It mattered in the Jonathan Mitchell case, which I still grieve that has not been adequately addressed. Jonathan, a black military veteran that was killed by a neighbor, but the Albuquerque police played a part in his death because he was shot in the arm. It should have been a survivable wound, but when the police arrived on the scene, they took his brother and handcuffed him so his brother could not administer first aid. The police did not administer first aid. And it's my understanding that even when the ambulance arrived, they delayed the ambulance from rendering any help. Unfortunately, the DOJ did not address these type types of incidents because it wasn't the police that did the shooting. I assume that's the reason they didn't address it. But it's definitely a problem. And our DA, our former Attorney General chose not to do anything about it. And because the DOJ didn't address it in their report, I don't expect that it's going to be addressed by the consent decree. So I guess my question is there any hope for, if not the Mitchell case, but any future cases that don't involve a shooting death by the police, but other forms of racial profiling and abuse due to race, is there any hope that our oversight board is going to address those types of issues?
I grabbed it from Ray because I wanted to answer quickly first. As I said, my biggest problem with the ordinance is that as written, it restricts the police oversight board from any kind of systematic evaluation of just those kinds of concerns. It limits systematic evaluation to use of force. You could look at race or mental health in those use of force complaints, but the oversight board does not have the ability to do a random audit of how police deal with mental health issues. It does not authorize the oversight board to do a random audit of cases involving race. It does not authorize the oversight board to do a random audit of differential policing in different neighborhoods. That's a serious flaw in the ordinance, and as written, it will prevent any serious investigation of anything other than use of force. And you're right, the consent decree is going to be limited to use of force because that's the only problem that DOJ addressed.
Well, it would be helpful if we at least admitted that we live in a racist country. Because until we do that, I think we're just talking around the edges. The fact that right now, 86%, I believe, of people that are incarcerated are people of color. And I refuse to believe that when born, 86% of those folks say, you know what, I'm going to choose life or crime. And I don't believe that only 14% of white folks say, you know, I'm going to copy my persons of color, brothers and sisters, and be incarcerated. And the rest say, you know what, I think I'm going to go on to college and do whatever it is that happens. That's not the case. The case is pretty obvious. And anybody that talks about who gets incarcerated, who gets stopped, who gets profiled, is just not paying attention. Whether it's Mitchell or Scott or Brown or anyone that's been shot, I don't think it's a coincidence that they're black. I don't think it's a coincidence that they're being followed, however that manifests itself. I think it's a situation where this society has decided that there are some marginal folk. There are poor people and people of color whom you can do with pretty much as you wish, and you can get away with it. And it's been inculcated into the system that we call public safety. It is not public safety. It is a place where a lot of folks go to play out some of their worst thoughts about humanity. It has been that way, and if somebody thinks that I'm being overly critical of the way the situation is, then I'd like to talk to you individually and find out why I'm so wrong. But in my case, I know that when Darren White was the public safety officer, I asked him directly, you will not, we confirmed that person, by the way. I didn't vote for him. But that person was confirmed as the public safety officer. And I asked him directly, will you profile folks? Will you purposely stop a black person, a Native American person, an Hispano, Latino, Chicano? And he said, no. What we use is predictive crime prevention. And so I asked him to describe that, because that was one of the first times I'd ever heard that. And he proceeded to describe profiling. So even after they have been made aware of what they're doing and have been doing forever, they still try to find a way to get around it and a way to justify what they've been doing all along.
I urge, this will be short, I urge you all to read the new Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. It's by Michelle Alexander, and if you don't want to read the whole book, I recommend you Google Jim Crow Mercury. It's an online review I wrote, so.
We have time for one more question. This always goes so fast, so unfortunately, one more.
I am slightly, or about as encouraged as I ever feel to hear that both of you agree that we need systemic change that goes beyond reform. And perhaps even more important than our mass incarceration in the age of colorblindness, I would urge everyone to read Our Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. And unfortunately for all of us, and also for people employed in law enforcement currently serves and protects a heteropatriarchal, settler colonial, white supremacist capitalist order. And while we continue to live in that order, I want to try and imagine for a moment, I don't know if this is possible, but can we create an alternative to the police? In my imagined future, prison has no place with justice, and the police have no place with justice. So while we continue to live in this current system, I don't want to call the police if I feel unsafe, but I want another option. Can the city provide me with one?
I wish I could tell you we have legislation on the docket ready to introduce, and by tomorrow we'll have a new system. We don't. And why? Follow the money. You know, some of these folks that are incarcerated aren't incarcerated because someone wants to keep them off the streets because they're so bad. It's because they bring a whole hell of a lot of money to somebody. It's no mystery that we have built more jails in the last 5 years, I believe, than we have built community hospitals. Hospitals that deal with indigent folks, or mental institutions, or hospitals that help people that are experiencing mental illness. So our priorities are absolutely wrong. And I wish I could tell you that tomorrow we're going to look at that. I have in the past, and we now have in place, a CIT team. It's a crisis intervention team, which is very important. But it's 5 people that we just run ragged, trying to go from one situation to another, and in most cases don't get there in time because either the SWAT team has essentially carved out their territory and don't allow anybody in, or some other situation where they're busy dealing with something else. And that's part of what we've done as a city and a society. We've decided that it's easier, and again, I go back to saying, a lot of us say, well, you know, they asked for it. They're criminals. They're whatever. So if the police need to do that, then they should be allowed to do that. I haven't heard anybody say, you know what? Let's look at, and we've looked at where the CIT team and the Coast team have been able to talk to folks, bring down that tension, so that the folks that are experiencing those terrible situations in their lives are able to then at least come back to where they're able to function. And we have statistics to show that that works. But we also have people who have vested interests in continuing, donning on their flak jackets or whatever they're called, bulletproof jackets. And we even had 2 tanks given to us by the military. And people were happy. You should have seen them. They were like little kids. Everybody wanted to drive one. Fortunately, we did pass legislation that said that's got to go back. And they were sent back to the military. But it was, when you go down to Clovis, and they have 2 of them. And they're 1/8 the population of Albuquerque. You go down to other places, and they're happy to have that. Artesia has the terrorist training facility, or I don't even know what it's called. And they're happy as can be. Please, make sure we don't get rid of the terrorists, because look at all the money it's bringing in. Or let's create more terrorists. So I hope that, I don't think in my time, but I hope soon we'll start looking at it from a different point of view. And it's not police that we need.
Since we're all human, any system that's set up, no matter how just it is when it starts, ends up gravitating towards a concentration of power, and the institutions of that system start to just be devoted to protecting those positions of power. The only solution is not a system. There's no perfect system. The solution is constant vigilance within the system you're in to break up those concentrations of power. And I'll just finish by saying the questioner said, currently the police and the army and everybody else is devoted to protecting the powerful. There is a quote that Michelle Alexander gave. She didn't give a footnote. I looked it up. I found it to make sure it was actually said, and it was. And it said that the purpose of government is to, quote, protect the opulent minority from the majority, unquote. James Madison.
So there's your answer. Become the opulent minority.
I believe that's all the time we have for today. I'd like to again thank Alan Wagman and Ray Gardun for spending time with us in this lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Hi there.
I am attending Citizens Academy now, several members of the board, but I didn't want to bring it up, but a lot of the questions that were asked by that group that were selected for that are standard